The gate was still warm from the blowtorch when Vanessa Kirk pointed her manicured finger at it like she'd built it herself. "You don't own this road anymore, Mr. Hobbs," she said, clipboard pressed against her chest. "The association does. Effective immediately, that'll be $40 a week to pass through, or you can use the county road. 90 minutes the long way. Your choice." I stood there in my dress blues, still smelling like jet fuel and airline coffee, 26 hours off a transport out of Naples, and I looked at a steel gate bolted across a road my family had cut into that canyon in 1911. $40 a week, $95,000 total, split across 41 lake cabin families, billed as an emergency road maintenance assessment for a road none of them owned 1 inch of. A private resort flip valued, on paper I hadn't seen yet, at $3.2 million. Membership passes to lake water that had run free off my family's land for over 100 years, now selling for $600 a season to people who thought they were buying into paradise. By the end of this, Vanessa Kirk would be looking at $92,400 in court-ordered restitution, and not $1 of it would come out of that white Range Rover Sport parked sideways across my grandfather's cattle guard. But that's not the part that scared her. The part that scared her came later, when I laid a single piece of paper on a folding table in the community rec hall, in front of 40 people who thought they'd bought lakefront property with a road that would always be there. I didn't raise my voice, I never do. 22 years in the Navy teaches you that the loudest man in the room is usually the one about to lose it. I just said, "Take a look at the deed number in the top corner. Then look up who's held it since 1911. Vanessa Kirk's face did something I'd only seen twice before in my life, once on a chief petty officer who just realized his paperwork was about to sink his career, and once on my ex-wife's lawyer the day he found out about the prenup. She didn't know yet what that deed meant. Nobody in that room did, not even Edith Calloway, sitting in the back row with her oxygen tank hissing quietly beside her, the only person in that HOA who'd ever actually shaken my hand and meant it. That's where this story starts, not with the gate, with a road, a deed, and a woman who thought a clipboard was the same thing as the law. My name is Walter Hobbs. Everybody calls me Walt. I'm 63 years old. I spent 22 years in the United States Navy as a fleet engineer, and I retired Chief Warrant Officer 4, which is a fancy way of saying I fixed things nobody else wanted to touch, and I did it without complaining. After the Navy, I stayed on another 8 years doing contract engineering for the Merchant Marine, mostly overseas, mostly gone. I came home 4-6 weeks a year, tops. That's the only reason it took me this long to notice what was happening to my own land. The land is Hobbs Canyon. My great-grandfather, Elias Hobbs, homesteaded it in 1911 under the Enlarged Homestead Act, 480 acres of dry canyon country running from the county road up to Pinon Lake, a natural reservoir fed by snowmelt that never went dry, not even in the drought years. Elias cut the road himself with a mule team and a horse-drawn scraper, blasted through 2 rock shelves with dynamite he bought on credit, and it took him and his 2 sons the better part of 4 years. That road is the only way in or out of the lake basin. There is no other route. The canyon walls see to that. My grandfather built the ranch house at the mouth of the canyon in 1934, hand-notched cedar logs, a stone chimney he laid himself, river rock carried up from the creek bed 1 wheelbarrow at a time. I grew up in that house. I can still close my eyes and smell it. Wood smoke, saddle leather, the particular dust that canyon kicks up in July, dry and sharp, like the inside of a hot skillet. There's a family cemetery on a rise behind the house, 3 generations of Hobbs men and women under hand-cut sandstone markers. My grandfather, my father, my mother, my brother who didn't come home from K-San. I know the sound that gate at the cemetery makes, that particular creak, because I've opened it more times than I care to count. When the county subdivided the lakefront in 1987 and cabin lots went up for sale around Pinion Lake, my father, Earl Hobbs, God rest him, granted the newly formed Pinion Lake Homeowners Association a revocable license to use our road for access. Not an easement, not a sale, a license, explicitly revocable, recorded at the county clerk's office, document number 87-4471. My father signed it because he was a decent man who didn't want 40 families driving through his cornfield trying to find another way to the water. He never once expected anybody to forget who owned the ground under their tires. Vanessa Kirk showed up 11 years ago, back when she was still going by her maiden name, Vanessa Pruitt, selling real estate for a firm out of the county's seat. She married into money, Randall Kirk, commercial developer, divorced him 3 years later and kept the name, the client list, and, from what I could tell, the taste for parking a $100,000 SUV somewhere it didn't belong. She got herself elected HOA president 6 years back on a platform of professionalizing the community, which turned out to mean higher dues, private contracts with companies she happened to have a financial stake in, and a 5-year plan nobody but her had actually read all the way through. She wore blazers to homeowner meetings like she was walking into a boardroom, carried a clipboard everywhere like it was a badge, and had a way of talking to people, especially older people, especially widows, like she was doing them a favor just by looking at them. I didn't know any of that yet, standing at that gate in my dress blues with my sea bag still in the truck. All I knew was that somebody had welded steel across my family's road, and I intended to find out exactly who gave them the right. The date was a Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. to be exact. I know because I checked my watch out of pure habit, the same habit that kept ships from running aground on my watch for 22 years. Time, place, condition. Write it down before you react to it. Vanessa Kirk stood there with her clipboard and her sunglasses pushed up into blonde hair that had clearly seen a salon more recently than my truck had seen a wash. And behind her, parked crooked across the cattle guard my grandfather poured in 1951, sat a brand new galvanized steel gate with a keypad entry box and a sign that read Pinion Lake HOA, private access, toll road, $40 weekly, cash or card. This is a joke, I said. Not loud, I don't do loud. It's a community safety initiative, she said, like she'd rehearsed it in a mirror. The road needed grading, drainage work, a proper gate for liability reasons. The association voted to fund it through a road maintenance assessment. You're welcome to review the minutes. This road runs entirely through my deeded property, I said. Every foot of it, from the county line to the lake. She smiled the way people smile when they think you're a little slow. Mr. Hobbs, the association has held access rights to this corridor for over 30 years. That's a matter of public record. It is, I said. I'd start there if I were you. I didn't argue past that. I turned around, got in my truck, and drove the 90 minutes the long way to get to my own front door, because I wasn't about to pay a toll to a woman I'd known for 4 minutes to drive across land my great-grandfather bled for. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table Elias Hobbs built by hand in 1899. Oak legs worn smooth and dark from 125 years of elbows, and I started a file. I want to explain something here, because it matters for everything that comes after. I didn't call a lawyer that week. I didn't put anything on social media. I didn't confront Vanessa Kirk again. I did what 22 years in engineering and Navy administration trained into my bones. I documented every single thing. I photographed the gate from 6 angles, with my phone's timestamp visible in each shot. I drove into the county seat and pulled the recorded documents on my own property. Deed history going back to the original 1911 homestead patent, all the way through my father's death and the transfer to me in 2009. I found document 87-4471. The license my father had granted the fledgling HOA back in '87, and I read every word of it twice. It was 1 page. It used the word revocable 3 separate times. It contained no consideration, no purchase price, no easement language whatsoever. Just a neighbor letting neighbors pass, the way ranch families had always done for each other out here. Then I found the notice. It came 4 days after the gate went up. Certified mail, return receipt requested, from an address in the county seat I didn't recognize. Kirk and Prager Property Management, LLC. Inside was a bill, $950, described as road access reactivation fee, non-member property adjacent to association corridor, due within 30 days or subject to a lien filing against my property under what the letter called the association's governing declarations. I want you to sit with that for a second, because here's what most homeowners don't know, and Vanessa Kirk was counting on nobody in that whole basin knowing it either. An HOA cannot place a lien against property that was never part of the association to begin with, and it certainly cannot lien land the association doesn't own so much as a fence post of. My 480 acres had never been part of the Pinon Lake Homeowners Association. Not one deed restriction, not one covenant, not one signature from my father or from me ever bound Hobbs Canyon to that HOA's governing documents. They were billing a non-member for access to a road that ran through his own front yard. I photographed the bill. I made 3 copies. I mailed my own letter back, certified, return receipt requested, informing Kirk and Prager Property Management that the license granted under document 87-4471 was revocable at the licensor's discretion, that I was the current licenser by inheritance, and that I was formally revoking said license, effective in 30 days, per the terms written into the original 1987 grant. I cited the document number. I kept the receipt. I did not raise my voice because there was nobody to raise it at. I mailed a letter into a mailbox and drove home in the quiet. That should have been the end of it, a private matter between me and a road. It wasn't. That was just the door creaking open. The real find came 9 days later in the basement of the county records office, a low-ceilinged room that smelled like mildew and old toner, fluorescent lights humming overhead like a dying appliance. I'd gone back to pull the HOA's own governing documents, their CC and Rs, their articles of incorporation, anything on file, because I wanted to understand exactly what Vanessa Kirk thought gave her the authority to bill me in the first place. What I found instead was a filing from 4 months earlier, articles of organization for a new limited liability company, Pinon Lake Resort Holdings LLC, registered agent Vanessa Kirk, managing member Vanessa Kirk. Filed the same month, I'd later confirm that the HOA board, a 5-person board where Vanessa held 3 votes through proxies from absent owners, approved the road maintenance assessment of $95,000 split across 41 member households. I sat in a hard plastic chair with a stack of photocopies in my lap and did the math out loud, quietly, the way you do when a number doesn't make sense and you need to hear it to believe it. $40 a week per household times 41 households ran well past $200,000 a year in toll revenue alone. Revenue flowing not to the HOA's operating account, records showed, but to a merchant account tied to Kirk and Prager Property Management. Add the membership passes to Pinon Lake Water Access, $600 a season, sold not just to the 41 existing cabin owners, but advertised, I found, on a glossy new website to outside buyers who'd never owned a foot of property up there. Add a pre-sale marketing packet dated 3 weeks earlier, pitching investors on 18 new luxury cabin sites around the lake basin, valuing the completed development at $3.2 million, contingent, the fine print read, on secured exclusive gated access to Pinon Lake via the established association road corridor. Established, that was the word they used. Established, like it had grown there naturally, like nobody's great-grandfather had cut it out of solid rock with dynamite bought on credit. I drove home that night past the turnoff to Edith Calloway's place, and I saw her porch light on, and something made me pull in. Edith Calloway is 78 years old. She's a widow. Her husband, Frank, served 2 tours in Vietnam and came home with lungs that never fully recovered, and Edith spent the back half of her marriage as his nurse before she ever became his widow. She served 4 years herself, Army, back when women who did that got a lot less thanks than they deserved. She lives on a fixed income in a cabin her husband built with his own hands in 1979, half a mile from the lake, and she's been on supplemental oxygen for 3 years now, a machine humming in the corner of her living room like a second heartbeat. She met me at the door with the concentrator's tubing looped over her ears and a stack of mail in her lap she couldn't quite lift with steady hands anymore. "They sent me this," she said, and handed me a letter from the HOA. It was a notice of special assessment, $1,200, her share of the road fee, due in full within 60 days, or the association would pursue all available remedies, including a lien. Underneath it was a second letter, this one almost worse, a notice that her request for a hardship exemption on the assessment, filed because her oxygen concentrator ran off the cabin's generator during outages, and she couldn't afford both the fuel and the fee, had been reviewed by the board and denied, as exceptions would set an unsustainable precedent for the community. "I called her," Edith said, meaning Vanessa. "I told her about Frank, about the oxygen, about how I don't have $1,200 sitting around." "You know what she told me?" She said, "Mrs. Calloway, we all have to make sacrifices for the good of the community." I sat down across from her at her kitchen table, and I looked at that oxygen machine humming in the corner, and something in me went very quiet and very still. The same stillness I used to feel right before a piece of failing equipment told you exactly how it was going to fail, if you were patient enough to listen. "Edith," I said, "how would you feel about coming to a meeting with me?" Edith looked at me a long moment, the concentrator ticking away in the corner, and I could see her weighing it. The woman who'd spent 4 years in the army learning not to flinch, and the widow who'd spent the last decade learning that flinching was sometimes the only safe move left. "What kind of meeting?" she said. Not a question, really, more like she already suspected the answer and wanted to hear me say it out loud. "The annual HOA meeting, 2 weeks from Thursday, the rec hall." I kept my voice even. "I think it's time some people in that room learned a few things about the road they've been paying tolls on." She reached over and turned the concentrator's flow dial down half a click, quieting the hiss so she could hear herself think, a habit I'd noticed old Navy men do with radio static. "Frank used to say, the loudest man in a room usually had the weakest hand," she said. "You don't strike me as a loud man, Walter." "I'm not planning on being one." She almost smiled. "Good. I've had enough loud people this year to last me the rest of my life." Then her face changed, something tightening around her eyes. "She came out here herself, you know, Vanessa, week before that denial letter, stood right where you're standing, told me the community valued my service, and then told me if I couldn't pay, maybe it was time to consider whether this lifestyle was still sustainable for someone in my position." Edith's hands, resting on the table, weren't steady, but her voice was. Meaning sell, meaning get out, meaning make room for whatever she's building up there. I thought about the LLC filing folded in my jacket pocket, Pinion Lake Resort Holdings, Vanessa Kirk's name typed twice on the same page, and I thought about 18 new luxury lots drawn up on a glossy pre-sale packet. And I understood, sitting in that kitchen with the smell of instant coffee and the low mechanical breath of an oxygen machine, exactly what sustainable meant to a woman like that. It meant Edith Calloway's cabin, bought and flipped, water view included, once the old widow got tired of being squeezed. "She's not getting your cabin," I said. I hadn't planned to say it, but once it was out, I meant it the way I used to mean orders I gave on a flight deck. Final, no negotiation implied. Edith studied me, and for the first time since I'd walked in, something in her posture eased, just slightly, like a rope going from taut to merely held. You sound awful sure of yourself for a man who got run off his own road 2 weeks ago. I didn't get run off, I said. I just hadn't shown my hand yet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines the way it always did that time of evening, and somewhere down the ridge I could hear a truck downshifting on the long grade, probably another cabin family, coming home the 90-minute way, paying tolls on a road that had never belonged to anyone but my family in the first place. The next morning I drove to the county sheriff's substation and asked for the deputy who handled civil disputes out in the Canyon district. His name was Deputy Ray Torres, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who'd grown up 2 towns over and knew the difference between a property dispute and a real crime, which is more than I can say for some. I'm not asking you to do anything yet, I told him, spreading my file across his desk, the deed history, the 87-4471 license, my revocation letter, the certified mail receipts, the LLC filing. I want you to know what's coming, so when it comes, you're not walking in blind. He read through it slowly, the way careful men read things, and when he got to the LLC filing, he looked up. Pinion Lake Resort Holdings, he said. Same initials as the association's toll account. That's not an accident. No, sir, it is not. What do you need from me? Nothing right now, just, when I revoke that license formally, 30 days from my letter, there's a good chance somebody up there doesn't take it well. I'd like you to already know why. He nodded slowly and made a copy of everything for his own file, which is exactly what I wanted. A deputy sheriff with prior knowledge is worth more than a deputy sheriff surprised at a scene. I filed my formal revocation with the county recorder 11 days later, a 1-page instrument, notarized, citing document 87-4471 by its full recording number, stating plainly that the licensor, Walter E. Hobbs, was exercising his reserved right of revocation as successor in interest to the original grantor, Earl Hobbs, effective 30 days from the date of recording. I sent copies by certified mail to the HOA's registered agent, to Kirk and Prager Property Management, and P. Because I'd learned by then that Vanessa Kirk liked to claim she never received things, I hand-delivered a 4th copy to the HOA's own mailbox at the rec hall. And I photographed myself doing it. Timestamp visible, 11:14 a.m., a Thursday. I also pulled a county road permit. Here's what most homeowners don't know. If you own land outright and you want to install a gate or barrier across a private road that runs through your own property, and no public right-of-way has ever been dedicated across it, you generally have every right to control access. But you still want the paperwork in hand before you act, because a permit on file turns some guy building a fence into a documented lawful property improvement, and that distinction matters enormously the moment anyone calls the sheriff on you. I filed for a driveway/gate permit under the county's private road ordinance, paid the $41 fee, and got my approval 9 days later, laminated it, and kept it in the glove box of my truck like a ship's manifest. Then I waited out the 30 days. I want to be honest about what that waiting felt like, because it wasn't calm the whole way through. I'd lie awake some nights running the numbers again. 95,000 in assessments, 600 a season per water pass, times God knew how many passes sold, 3.2 million in projected resort value. And I'd think about Edith Calloway's oxygen machine humming in the corner of her cabin. And some nights, the anger sat in my chest like a piece of bad ballast, heavy and wrong. And I had to remind myself that a man who moves on anger makes mistakes, a careful man doesn't have to clean up later. On day 26, 3 days before my revocation took legal effect, Vanessa Kirk made her first real mistake, and she made it in front of a witness. Edith Calloway called me at 6:50 in the evening, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "Walter," she said, "you need to come down here. Something's happening at my well." I got there in 11 minutes. What I found was Vanessa Kirk's white Range Rover parked half on Edith's gravel drive, engine running, and two men in unmarked coveralls standing over Edith's well pump housing with a cordless bolt cutter, having just sheared clean through the padlock securing the access panel, the panel that controlled the shared irrigation line running off the community's water main. The same line, it turned out, that fed the auxiliary backup generator hookup Edith used during power outages to keep her oxygen concentrator running. Edith stood on her porch in her housecoat, tubing looped over her ears, her voice cracking as she called out, "That's my water access, you can't just... That generator line is medical necessity. I have a doctor's letter on file with the..." "Ma'am, we have authorization from the association board to disconnect non-compliant auxiliary hookups," one of the men said, not even looking at her, while the other one wrenched the panel door open. Vanessa Kirk stood beside her Range Rover with her phone in her hand, filming. I found out later she'd intended it as evidence for the HOA's own files, proof of enforcement action, never imagining anyone else's camera would be running too. And when Edith started toward the well, oxygen line trailing, Vanessa stepped directly into her path. "Mrs. Calloway, please don't interfere with authorized association contractors," she said, loud enough that I caught every word from 30 feet away, my own phone already up and recording, my hands steadier than they had any right to be given what I was watching. "You were notified in writing that non-compliant hookups would be disconnected. This isn't personal." "I have emphysema," Edith said. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. "That generator keeps my oxygen machine running when the power drops. You are cutting off my medical equipment's backup power." Vanessa Kirk did not step aside. She did not lower her phone. What she said next, I have on video. Clean audio, timestamp 7:04 p.m, and I have played it for exactly the people who needed to hear it and no one else. Because some things you say for the moment they'll do the most damage. "Then I'd suggest," she said, "you find a generator that doesn't depend on association infrastructure. This community has standards. If those standards create hardship, that's between you and your circumstances, not something the association is obligated to accommodate indefinitely." I stepped in at that point, camera still running, and said only, "Ma'am, you're standing on private property, cutting a lock on infrastructure that services a medical necessity, without her consent and without any court order. I'd stop right there if I were you." Vanessa Kirk turned, saw me, saw my phone, and for just a second, 1 second, caught clean on the recording, something like fear crossed her face, before the composure slid back into place like a mask resettling. "Mr. Hobbs, this doesn't concern you. This is association business on an association member's property." "It concerns me," I said, "because I'm the one who's going to be handing this footage to the Sheriff's Department and to Adult Protective Services, given that Mrs. Calloway is a vulnerable adult on documented medical equipment. And it concerns me because in 3 days, none of you are going to have any lawful way to reach this property at all." She didn't understand what I meant by that yet. Nobody did. I watched it sail right past her, the way a warning shot sails past a ship that doesn't yet know it's already been targeted. The two men in coveralls left the panel hanging open and drove off without finishing whatever they'd come to do, and Vanessa Kirk followed a minute later, tires spitting gravel, and I spent the next hour with Edith, splicing a temporary bypass on her generator line myself. A fleet engineer's hands are good for exactly this kind of thing, until I was satisfied her concentrator would run through the night, no matter what happened to that panel again. Then I drove home, sat down at my grandfather's oak table, and I filed a report the next morning with Deputy Torres, video attached, and a separate written complaint with the county's Adult Protective Services Office, citing interference with medical equipment belonging to a vulnerable elder, referencing the relevant elder abuse statute under state law, which covers financial exploitation and neglect of vulnerable adults, and which I'd looked up 2 weeks earlier, when I first started suspecting Vanessa Kirk's sustainability talk was headed somewhere like this. I also, that same week, sent formal written notice, certified of course, to every one of the 41 cabin households in the Pinon Lake Basin, not accusing anyone of anything, just informing them, plainly, that the license under document 87-4471, permitting association use of the Hobbs Canyon Road, had been lawfully revoked effective in 3 days. that the road was private property, and that a gate would be installed at that time, restricting access to those with express written permission from the landowner. I invited every recipient, individually, to the HOA's own upcoming annual meeting, where I said I intended to explain the situation in full with documentation. I did not mention what documentation. I did not mention Pinion Lake Resort Holdings LLC. I did not mention what I'd found in that basement records room, or what I now understood about $600 water passes sold to strangers, or a $3.2 million packet promising exclusive gated access to a road that legally belonged, every inch of it, to a Navy engineer who'd been quietly assembling his case for 6 weeks, while everyone around him assumed he'd simply gone home to lick his wounds. 3 days later, at first light, with my permit laminated in the truck and Deputy Torres's cell number saved under a name I could find fast if I needed it, I drove out to the mouth of the canyon with a flatbed carrying a steel gate frame I'd had custom welded at a shop 2 counties over, and I began installing the only gate that was ever going to matter in this story. The gate went up in 4 hours. Galvanized steel, 12 feet wide, hung on posts I'd set in concrete 2 feet deep, with a keypad I controlled and a hand-painted sign underneath the manufactured one. Hobbs Family Land, private, no association access per revoked license 87-4471. I bolted it myself, in the same spot my great-grandfather's mule team had first broken ground in 1911, and when I stepped back to look at it, dust settling around my boots, I felt something in my chest ease for the first time in 6 weeks. Not triumph, just rightness. The way a piece of machinery feels when it's finally been torqued to spec. The annual HOA meeting was 2 days later, a Thursday, 7 o'clock, the rec hall smelling like old coffee and floor wax the way it always did. I want to describe that room the way I saw it walking in, because it matters. 40-some folding chairs, mostly full. Vanessa Kirk up front behind a table with a gavel she had no legal authority to use since the HOA's own bylaws called for a simple raised hand to call votes. But she liked the gavel, liked the sound of it, liked what it implied about who ran the room. Edith Calloway sat in the back row, oxygen tank at her feet, and beside her, at my invitation, sat Deputy Ray Torres, off-duty, in plain clothes, there as what I told the board chair truthfully was an interested observer of a civil matter. I'd also invited someone else, Molla Young, a reporter with the county's weekly paper who covered local government and had, I happen to know, done a prior story on HOA assessment abuses 2 counties over. She sat near the door with a notepad and a small recorder, unremarkable, exactly as I'd hoped she'd be. Vanessa opened the meeting by addressing recent unauthorized road closures, her words, and informed the room that the board was exploring legal remedies against a member she didn't name, but everyone in that room understood her to mean me. I'd like to speak to that, I said, standing. She hesitated half a second, then gestured, magnanimous, clipboard tucked under her arm like a scepter. Of course, Mr. Hobbs. Briefly. I walked to the front table and set down a single manila folder. I didn't rush. I've learned that a man who takes his time commands a room better than a man who's in a hurry to be believed. 6 weeks ago, I said, a gate went up across a road that runs entirely through land my family has owned since 1911. I want to read you the exact language from the document that has governed that road's use for the last 37 years. I laid the license on the table, 87-4471, and read it aloud, slow, the word revocable landing 3 separate times in that quiet room like a dropped wrench. My father granted this license as a courtesy in 1987 to help a young community reach the lake. He never sold this land, he never granted an easement, he granted a revocation at will license recorded at the county clerk's office, document number right there at the top for anyone who wants to verify it themselves. I formally revoked that license 29 days ago by certified letter to every one of you and by recorded instrument filed with the county. The road you have been paying tolls on for the last 2 months has never belonged to this association, not 1 square foot. The room had gone very still. I heard the oxygen concentrator hissing softly from the back row, the only sound besides my own voice. I also want to show you this. I laid down the second document, the LLC filing. Pinion Lake Resort Holdings. Vanessa Kirk's name typed twice. 4 months ago, your HOA president formed a private company. That same month, the board she controls through proxy votes approved a $95,000 road assessment on this membership for a road she does not own, has never owned, and was, at the time, actively working to convert into private toll infrastructure, supporting a resort development valued at $3.2 million. Water access passes have been sold, some of them to people who don't even live in this community, off a lake that has run free off Hobbs Land for over a century. I heard the room shift, a rustle of 40 people all turning slightly, not toward me, toward her. Vanessa Kirk's composure held for exactly as long as it takes a person to realize a room has already turned against them and there's no gavel loud enough to call it back. These are private business dealings. They have nothing to do with. They have everything to do with the $95,000 you build these families, I said, still not raising my voice, for access rights to a road you never owned in order to fund a private resort you stood to profit from personally, and they have everything to do with this. I nodded to Marla Young, who quietly turned her recorder's screen toward the front row so those nearest could see, and I played, from my own phone, the video from Edith Calloway's driveway, the bolt cutters, the severed padlock, Vanessa Kirk's voice clear as a bell. I'd suggest you find a generator that doesn't depend on association infrastructure. That's between you and your circumstances. Edith didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her oxygen concentrator did the talking, hissing quietly in the back row, while 40 of her neighbors watched a recording of their HOA president telling a 78-year-old widow with emphysema that her medical equipment wasn't the association's problem. Deputy Torres stood up then, unhurried, badge already out, though he was in plain clothes, and said, "Mrs. Kirk, I'm going to need you to step outside with me. We've got a complaint on file regarding interference with medical equipment belonging to a vulnerable adult, and I've got some questions about an LLC filing that looks a whole lot like it might involve misappropriation of HOA assessment funds." "You can't. This is a private meeting," Vanessa started, and I watched her reach instinctively for that clipboard like it was a life raft, like the sheer authority of holding it had gotten her through every difficult moment for 6 years and might get her through one more. It didn't. Deputy Torres walked her out the side door of that rec hall, past 40 of her own neighbors, past Edith Calloway's steady, unblinking stare, and out into a parking lot where 2 more county units were already waiting, because I'd made sure 3 days earlier that the sheriff's department had a full evidentiary package ready to act on the moment enough witnesses were in one room to make the arrest airtight. Her white Range Rover sat crooked in its usual reserved spot, and nobody in that lot looked at it like it meant anything at all anymore. The investigation that followed took 4 months. Forensic accountants working with the county district attorney's office traced the toll revenue and water pass sales through the Kirk and Prager property management merchant account and found that over the course of 8 months, Vanessa Kirk had personally diverted $41,000 in HOA assessment funds and water pass proceeds into accounts tied to Pinion Lake Resort Holdings, LLC, funds that were never disclosed to the board's other 4 members, 2 of whom, it turned out, had signed off on the assessment without ever reading the fine print, trusting her word the way people trust a woman in a good blazer with a clipboard. Vanessa Kirk pleaded guilty to felony theft by a fiduciary and to misdemeanor interference with a vulnerable adult's medical equipment, rather than risk trial on additional counts of securities fraud tied to the resort pre-sale packet, which had solicited $18,000 in refundable deposits from outside investors under false representations about guaranteed road access. The court ordered restitution of $92,400. The $41,000 in diverted funds, plus the full $95,000 assessment minus a partial credit already refunded voluntarily by 2 board members eager to distance themselves, plus court costs. She received 18 months with all but 60 days suspended, 5 years probation, and a permanent bar from serving on any homeowners association board in the state. Her real estate license was revoked by the state commission the following spring. The 2 men with the bolt cutters turned out to be day labourers Vanessa had hired off a job board, unaware of the medical equipment involved. Charges against them were dropped once they testified against her. The 2 board members who'd rubber-stamped the assessment resigned within the month, mortified, and both personally apologised to Edith Callaway, in writing, which I understand meant more to her than any dollar amount ever could. I reopened the road myself 3 weeks after the arrest, this time with a proper recorded easement, not a revocable licence, but a real one, granted on my own terms, to the 41 legitimate cabin households, free of charge, in perpetuity, so long as the road was maintained cooperatively and no one ever again tried to sell tolls on land that wasn't theirs. At the reorganised HOA's first clean election, they voted Edith Callaway in as president, unanimously, and when she called me afterward to tell me, her voice had a lightness in it I hadn't heard since I'd first met her on that porch with the mail she couldn't lift. I drive up to the canyon most evenings now, past the gate that still says Hobbs family land in my own hand, up to the cemetery on the rise where 3 generations of my family rest, and I sit there sometimes with the smell of dust and pine needles and something in the air over the lake that never quite leaves, and I think about how a road my great-grandfather cut with a mule and a stick of dynamite outlasted every scheme built to steal it. Here's what I learned, if it's worth anything to you. A revocable license is not a right, no matter how long someone's been using it. Read the actual word before you assume a courtesy is a guarantee. Document everything, calmly, before you ever raise your voice, because a quiet man with a paper trail beats a loud man with a grievance every single time. Watch how people treat the most vulnerable person in the room. That's the truest test of who they really are, and it will tell you exactly what they're capable of doing to you, given time and opportunity. And never, ever assume the man who just came home quiet has come home with nothing. Edith still calls me sometimes, just to talk, oxygen tank humming softly in the background. And last week she mentioned that a development company out of the city had sent a letter asking about acquisition opportunities near the lake. Same lake, different name on the envelope this time, but paperwork that looked, she said, awfully familiar. I told her I'd take a look,